In the spring of 1843, a Charleston physician named Dr. Nathaniel Pemberton was summoned to examine a patient at the Ravenswood estate, 3 miles north of the city. The call came at dawn, unusual timing that suggested urgency, but when Pemberton arrived, he found no medical emergency. Instead, he was led to a private study where the estate's owner, a man named Cornelius Ashford, presented him with a leather-bound medical journal and asked a single question that would haunt Pemberton for the rest of his life. Can a human being be bred like livestock across generations to enhance specific physical traits? The journal contained measurements taken over 26 years, documenting 3 generations of systematic human breeding. Height, weight, bone density, muscle circumference, carrying capacity, resistance to disease. Every metric recorded with scientific precision. But what disturbed Pemberton most deeply wasn't the measurements themselves. It was the photograph tucked between the journal's final pages. A daguerreotype showing a woman whose physical dimensions seemed to defy natural human development. She stood beside a doorframe for scale, her head nearly touching the top of the frame at what must have been 6 feet 3 inches. Her shoulders were so broad they appeared distorted in the image, and her arms showed muscular definition that Pemberton had never witnessed in any woman or in most men. The photograph's subject was identified only by a number, specimen 41, and according to Ashford's journal, she represented the culmination of an experiment that had consumed his family's resources and moral boundaries for more than a quarter century. Dr. Pemberton left Ravenswood Estate that morning without examining any patient, carrying instead a burden of knowledge he hadn't sought and couldn't easily ignore. He returned to his Charleston practice on Meeting Street and tried to resume normal work, but the image of that woman, the calculations in that journal, the casual way Ashford had presented systematic human breeding as scientific achievement rather than moral abomination, all of it lingered in his thoughts like a fever he couldn't break. Pemberton kept detailed personal diaries throughout his career, and his entries from April through June of 1843 reveal a man wrestling with what he'd witnessed. He wrote about the conflict between his medical training, which taught him to view human bodies as subjects for scientific study, and his religious beliefs, which insisted that human beings possessed inherent dignity that couldn't be reduced to physical measurements. He questioned whether he had any obligation to report what he'd seen, though to whom and under what authority remained unclear, since Ashford had broken no laws that Charleston's courts would recognize. The practice of breeding enslaved people for specific traits wasn't illegal in South Carolina, wasn't even particularly unusual, though most plantation owners conducted such programs with less systematic documentation and certainly without inviting physicians to review their methods. What made Ashford's program distinctive wasn't its cruelty, which was typical of slavery's broader system, but its scientific approach and its spectacular success in achieving exactly what it set out to accomplish. Pemberton's diaries note that he'd encountered other breeding programs during his medical practice, had been called to plantations to assist with difficult births or treat injuries, and had witnessed how enslaved people were paired according to owners' preferences rather than their own choices. But Ashford's program operated on a different scale entirely, with 3 generations of careful selection, producing results that seemed to push the boundaries of normal human physical development. The woman in the photograph, specimen 41, was the program's masterpiece, and Pemberton couldn't stop thinking about what her existence meant, what it revealed about the capacity for human cruelty when justified through scientific reasoning, and what it suggested about the enslaved people themselves who'd endured this systematic violation of their reproductive lives while somehow maintaining enough humanity to survive psychologically. Pemberton eventually made copies of certain pages from Ashford's journal before returning the original, telling himself that documentation was a form of bearing witness, that even if he couldn't stop what was happening, he could at least preserve evidence of what had been done. Those copies survived in Pemberton's personal papers, which were donated to the South Carolina Historical Society after his death in 1878. The papers remained largely unexamined until 1962, when a graduate student researching antebellum medical practices discovered them and recognized their significance. The copies included measurements, breeding pairings, and projections for future generations, but they also included something Pemberton added himself after visiting Ravenswood multiple times during the summer of 1843. His own observations of specimen 41, whom he learned was called Ruth by the people who lived with her in the quarters, though official records used only her designation number. Pemberton's observations paint a portrait that the measurements alone couldn't capture. He described Ruth as possessing not just unusual size and strength, but an intelligence and awareness that made her constantly watchful, as if she understood exactly what she represented and what her existence meant within the broader system of slavery. He noted that she spoke with careful precision, choosing words that revealed education beyond what most enslaved people received, suggesting someone had taught her to read and think critically, despite the enormous risks such education involved. He observed that other enslaved people at Ravenswood treated her with a complex mixture of respect, protectiveness, and something approaching reverence, as if her physical presence had become a symbol of resistance even when she engaged in no overt rebellious acts. Most significantly, Pemberton recorded that Ruth seemed to be preparing for something, though what exactly he couldn't determine. She moved with deliberate purpose, observed everything around her with intense focus, and maintained what Pemberton described as controlled rage, barely concealed beneath a surface of compliance. To understand Ruth's story, to comprehend how a human being could be bred for specific traits across 3 generations, and what psychological toll such a program inflicted, requires understanding Charleston in the decades leading to 1843, and the particular form slavery took in the Carolina Low Country. Charleston had built its wealth on rice cultivation, transforming coastal marshlands into productive fields through a labor system that was arguably more brutal than cotton plantation slavery in the Deep South. Rice cultivation required workers to stand in flooded fields for hours, exposed to mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever, their bodies bent under the Carolina sun while performing repetitive tasks that destroyed joints and muscles. The death rate among rice field workers was extraordinarily high, with many surviving only a few years after being assigned to field labor. This created constant demand for new workers and made plantation owners particularly interested in any methods that might produce workers who were stronger, more resistant to disease, and capable of sustained heavy labor. The Ashford family had arrived in South Carolina in 1768, part of the wave of wealthy English families seeking fortunes in colonial America. They established themselves in Charleston's merchant class initially, trading in rice, indigo, and increasingly enslaved people brought from West Africa and the Caribbean. By 1790, they'd accumulated enough capital to purchase land north of Charleston and establish Ravenswood Plantation, named for the massive live oak trees, draped with Spanish moss, that gave the property an appearance of natural grandeur, masking systematic brutality. The plantation grew to encompass 2,000 acres of tidal marshland transformed into rice fields, sustained by the labor of approximately 300 enslaved people who lived in wooden quarters that leaked during frequent rains and baked during summer months when Carolina humidity made breathing feel like drowning slowly. Cornelius Ashford's grandfather, William Ashford, had managed Ravenswood from 1790 until his death in 1815, operating it as a typical rice plantation with typical cruelty. But William's son, Cornelius's father, a man named Harrison Ashford, had different ambitions. Harrison had studied at the College of Charleston and developed interests that blended emerging scientific thinking with plantation management. He'd read about animal breeding programs in England, studied agricultural journals discussing crop improvement through selective seed selection, and become fascinated by whether similar principles could be applied to human beings. This wasn't original thinking. Plantation owners throughout the South had long practiced informal breeding, pairing enslaved people based on physical characteristics and breaking apart families that didn't produce desired results. But Harrison wanted to approach it systematically, to document everything, to prove that human beings could be improved through careful genetic selection, just like horses or cattle. Harrison began his breeding program in 1817, 2 years after inheriting Ravenswood. He started by surveying the entire enslaved population, measuring everyone, noting physical characteristics, tracking family relationships, and identifying individuals who possessed traits he considered valuable. He was particularly interested in height, muscular development, bone structure, and what he called constitutional vigor, meaning the ability to withstand disease and harsh conditions without succumbing. He created detailed records for each person, assigning them numbers, rather than using the names they'd been given by their families or communities. This numerical system was deliberate dehumanization, a way of transforming people into data points in an experiment that treated human reproduction as agricultural science. Harrison's program operated through forced pairings. He would select 2 people based on their physical characteristics and order them to form partnerships, separating existing couples if they didn't meet his criteria and punishing anyone who resisted. Children born from these forced unions were evaluated constantly, measured starting in infancy, tracked through development, and either incorporated into future breeding plans if they showed desired traits or sold away to other plantations if they failed to meet expectations. The cruelty of this system compounded across years and generations. Families were torn apart not once, but repeatedly, as children were sold or redistributed based on their physical development. Women were forced into partnerships with men they didn't choose, their reproductive lives controlled as completely as their labor. Men were evaluated like breeding stock, valued for genetic contribution rather than any human qualities. And all of this was documented in Harrison's journals with clinical precision that treated systematic dehumanization as scientific progress. Harrison died in 1831, but not before establishing the foundations that his son Cornelius would expand. Harrison had identified several family lines within Ravenswood's enslaved population that consistently produced children with desired physical traits, particularly unusual height and muscular development. He documented these lines across 2 generations, creating what he believed was proof that human breeding could produce measurable improvements in strength and size. Cornelius inherited both the plantation and the obsession in 1831. He was 24 years old, recently graduated from South Carolina College, and determined to prove his father's theories correct through even more rigorous methodology. Cornelius expanded the breeding program significantly, hiring overseers specifically to help with documentation and monitoring. He created a classification system that ranked every enslaved person at Ravenswood according to their breeding value, with the highest-ranked individuals receiving better food rations and lighter work assignments to maximize their reproductive potential. He developed projections for future generations, calculating how many years would be required to produce individuals with specific physical characteristics and planning, breeding pairs decades in advance. His journals from this period read like agricultural breeding manuals, discussing genetic inheritance with the same language used for livestock improvement, as if the people he was manipulating were merely biological material rather than human beings with inner lives, emotions, and relationships. Among the family lines Harrison had identified as most promising was one that traced back to a woman who'd been brought from Jamaica in 1800. The records identified her only as Subject 7, though her descendants would later say her name was Abeni, a Yoruba name meaning we prayed for her arrival. Abeni stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, extraordinary for a woman of that era, and possessed unusual physical strength that made her valuable for heavy labor. She'd been purchased specifically because of these characteristics, brought from Jamaica, where breeding programs had operated longer than in mainland American colonies, creating populations of enslaved people who were systematically selected for size and strength across multiple generations. Abeni was paired with a man identified in records as Subject 12, whose actual name was Samuel, who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and had been born on a Virginia plantation before being sold to South Carolina. Their union was forced, arranged by Harrison Ashford based solely on their physical characteristics without regard for their own preferences or feelings. Abeni gave birth to a daughter in 1818, a girl who would be designated Subject 23 in the breeding records, but whom Abeni named Keturah, meaning incense or sacrifice. Keturah inherited her mother's height, reaching 6 feet by age 15, and showed the muscular development Harrison had hoped for. She became a centerpiece of his breeding program, monitored constantly, measured regularly, and eventually paired with another carefully selected man when she reached what Harrison determined was optimal breeding age. Keturah was forced into partnership with a man designated Subject 19, whose name was Daniel, who'd been born on Ravenswood and stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with shoulders that spanned 23 inches across. Daniel had been selected for the breeding program as a child, raised with extra rations to maximize his growth, and trained for tasks that would develop his strength. He and Keturah produced a daughter in 1838, and this child would become Specimen 41, the woman whose photograph would eventually disturb Dr. Pemberton so profoundly. The baby was born on a humid August morning when Charleston's heat made everything feel oppressive and heavy. The birth took place in a small wooden structure that served as Ravenswood's birthing room, attended by an elderly midwife named Patience, who delivered hundreds of babies over 4 decades, and who'd learned to hide her sorrow at bringing children into a world where they would be owned and controlled from their first breath. Keturah labored through the night and into morning, finally delivering just after dawn as light filtered through gaps in the wooden walls. The baby was unusually large, measuring 24 inches long, with a weight of 9 pounds, proportions that immediately signaled she was developing according to the genetic patterns Cornelius Ashford had spent years trying to cultivate. Cornelius was notified immediately and arrived at the birthing room within an hour, accompanied by his chief overseer, a man named Edmund Vale, who kept detailed records for the breeding program. They measured the infant with the same clinical attention used for valuable livestock, recording dimensions, noting the proportional length of her limbs, examining her bone structure for signs of the robust development they'd projected based on her parents' characteristics. Cornelius assigned the baby her designation, Specimen 41, marking her as the 41st child born into the breeding program since he'd taken control of Ravenswood. The number would follow her throughout her life, appearing in every record, every evaluation, every projection about her future use. Keturah wanted to name her daughter Ruth, after a biblical figure who'd shown loyalty and courage in the face of exile and loss. But that name never appeared in official plantation records. To Cornelius and his administrative apparatus, the baby was simply 41, a data point representing potential validation of theories about human breeding. The extra food rations began immediately. Cornelius ordered that Keturah receive portions of salt, pork, cornmeal, beans, and vegetables that exceeded standard allotments, ensuring optimal nutrition during nursing to maximize the infant's early growth. This created immediate tensions in the quarters, where food was already scarce and distributed in carefully measured amounts designed to maintain work capacity without promoting health or strength beyond what benefited the plantation's productivity. Some people resented the special treatment, seeing it as favoritism that came at their expense when the plantation's overall food supply remained fixed. Others understood that the extra rations were a poisoned gift, coming with expectations and control that would make Ruth's life fundamentally different from normal enslavement's already unbearable conditions. Patience, the midwife who delivered Ruth, tried to help Keturah navigate the complicated social dynamics the extra rations created. She advised discretion, suggested sharing portions with others to build community support rather than resentment, and warned that Ruth would face unique challenges as she grew. The child would need the community's protection and solidarity, and alienating people through perceived privilege, even involuntary privilege imposed by owners, would make survival more difficult for both mother and daughter. Keturah followed this advice as carefully as she could, maintaining relationships with other women in the quarters, sharing what extra food she dared, and trying to raise Ruth with some semblance of normal childhood, despite the constant surveillance that characterized every stage of the girl's development. Ruth's early years were defined by being constantly observed and measured. Edmund Vail kept detailed journals documenting her growth, and entries from 1838 through 1842 read like livestock breeding records, noting every developmental milestone with clinical precision but no acknowledgement of human experience or emotion. Ruth, at 3 months, shows 15% greater muscle mass in limbs compared to average infants. Mother's nutrition adequate, recommend maintaining enhanced rations. Ruth at 8 months demonstrates advanced motor control, pulling to standing position earlier than typical development timeline. Father's height genetics apparently expressed, projecting adult height of 6 feet 2 inches to 6 feet 4 inches. Ruth at 12 months walking unassisted, showing grip strength approximately double that of average children her age. Recommend continued monitoring and enhanced nutrition through early childhood. Cornelius read these reports with deep satisfaction, convinced that his breeding program was producing exactly the results 3 generations of careful selection should yield. He began showing Ruth off to visitors even when she was still a toddler, hosting gatherings where plantation owners from across South Carolina and neighboring states came specifically to observe her and hear about Ravenswood's breeding program. These visits were torture for Ruth as she grew old enough to understand what was happening. She would be brought out to stand before strange men who discussed her body as if she were livestock, evaluated her measurements against their own enslaved populations, and debated whether implementing similar programs on their plantations would yield sufficient returns to justify the investment. Ruth learned from these exhibitions that she was not seen as fully human by the men who controlled every aspect of her life, and this knowledge shaped her understanding of the world in ways that would have profound consequences years later. By age 5, Ruth stood 3 feet 11 inches tall, significantly above average for her age, with proportional muscular development that made her appear even more unusual. Her arms and legs were longer than typical children's proportions, giving her a gangly appearance that suggested she would eventually achieve the exceptional height Cornelius projected in his journals. Her body showed definition in the shoulder and back muscles that typically didn't appear until adolescence, and her grip strength was remarkable enough that Vail documented her ability to hold weights that children twice her age struggled with. But measurements didn't capture Ruth's psychological development, which was equally exceptional, though for reasons Cornelius never fully understood. Ruth absorbed everything around her with intense focus, learning to read situations and people's moods with uncanny accuracy. She understood by age 5 that she was constantly being evaluated, that her body was property more valuable than most, and that this value made her both protected and trapped in ways other enslaved children weren't. She learned to mask her thoughts, presenting a blank face to white observers, while fury and awareness built inside her like pressure in a sealed container. She learned the dual consciousness required for survival, being who she needed to be for those who owned her, while preserving some inner self that remained separate from their control. Keturah taught Ruth as much as she could about their family history, about Abeni, who'd been Ruth's grandmother, about the fact that their unusual size and strength came from West African heritage, where women had been tall and powerful before being captured and commodified. These conversations gave Ruth a framework for understanding herself that differed radically from Cornelius Ashford's narrative of successful breeding. Where Cornelius saw genetic improvement through selective pairing, Keturah taught Ruth to see inherited strength from ancestors who'd been free, characteristics that belonged to her rather than being created by the Ashford's program. Patience also played a crucial role in Ruth's early development. The elderly midwife had delivered Ruth, had watched her grow, and had recognized early that this child possessed not just physical exceptionality, but intelligence and awareness that would make her either a leader or a martyr, depending on how circumstances unfolded. Patience taught Ruth about Charleston's history of slave resistance, about Denmark Vesey's planned uprising in 1822 that had been betrayed before it could begin, about the constant undercurrent of rebellion that existed even when it couldn't be expressed openly. She taught Ruth to be patient, to survive, to wait for opportunities, rather than acting from anger in ways that would get her killed without achieving anything meaningful. By age 7, Ruth was put to work at tasks specifically designed to build her physical capabilities further. She carried loads of rice from fields to processing areas, developing her back and leg muscles. She lifted heavy barrels, building upper body strength. She performed labor that would typically be assigned to adolescent boys, and she managed it adequately despite her young age. Cornelius watched this progress with pride that bordered on obsession, documenting every achievement as further evidence that his breeding program could produce superior workers who would ultimately generate enormous profits through both their labor and their value in breeding future generations. The quarters at Ravenswood had developed their own distinct culture over decades, maintaining elements of West African traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery's attempts to erase cultural identity. People spoke Gula, a Creole language blending English with African linguistic patterns that allowed conversations white observers couldn't fully understand. They cooked traditional foods when possible, maintained spiritual practices that incorporated African beliefs, and created tight-knit communities that provided emotional support in a world designed to break their spirits. Ruth grew up embedded in this culture, learning its codes and patterns, understanding how resistance operated through subtle acts that flew beneath overseers' notice. She learned which songs carried coded messages, how information moved through seemingly casual conversations, and which people could be trusted with dangerous knowledge. This education prepared her for roles she couldn't yet imagine but would eventually need to fill. Among the enslaved population at Ravenswood were natural leaders who commanded respect through wisdom, courage, or spiritual authority. One such person was a man named Gabriel, 48 years old in 1843, who'd been born in Charleston and survived conditions that had killed many others. Gabriel worked as a blacksmith, a skilled position that gave him slightly more autonomy than field workers received, and he used that position to maintain awareness of everything happening on the plantation and in Charleston beyond. Gabriel had connections throughout the city's enslaved community, relationships built over decades that allowed information to flow between plantations and urban households. He knew which ship captains might be sympathetic to fugitives, which white abolitionists existed in Charleston despite the risk such beliefs created, and which routes through the Low Country offered the best chances for successful escape. More importantly, Gabriel understood how to read the political and social currents that shaped slavery's evolution, and by 1843 he was increasingly convinced that significant changes were approaching, though what form those changes would take remained uncertain. Gabriel watched Ruth's development with particular attention. He saw in her not just exceptional physical capabilities, but potential for leadership that could be channeled productively if circumstances allowed. He began teaching Ruth things that went far beyond what Cornelius's program intended, subtle lessons about power and resistance disguised as ordinary conversations. He taught her about leverage, both literal and metaphorical, about how strength could be applied efficiently rather than wastefully, about how understanding systems allowed you to find their vulnerabilities. He taught her to think strategically, to evaluate long-term consequences rather than acting impulsively, and to recognize that sometimes the most powerful resistance looked like patience and preparation rather than direct confrontation. By age 10, Ruth had internalized these lessons alongside Cornelius's constant measurements and evaluations. She performed her assigned labor without visible resistance, submitted to Vale's documentation without complaint, and maintained a facade of compliance that masked growing awareness and carefully controlled rage. But privately, she was preparing for something, though what exactly even she couldn't fully articulate yet. She watched everything, remembered everything, and waited for circumstances that might create opportunities for action. Ruth's measurements at age 10 documented systematic physical development that exceeded even Cornelius's optimistic projections. She stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, with measurements that approached those of adult women. Her chest measured 36 inches around, her arms measured 13 inches in circumference, and her shoulders spanned 20 inches across. She could lift loads that grown men struggled with, and Cornelius documented these achievements with satisfaction that completely ignored Ruth's humanity or psychological experience. He'd begun showing her off more frequently to visiting plantation owners, and these exhibitions became regular events where Ruth was made to demonstrate her strength by lifting heavy objects, carrying multiple rice sacks simultaneously, and performing feats that amazed observers who'd never witnessed such capabilities in any woman or even in most men. The visitors' reactions ranged from impressed to skeptical to disturbed, but most saw potential financial applications if Ravenswood's breeding program principles could be replicated on their own properties. Cornelius encouraged this interest, sharing his methods openly and discussing how coordinated breeding programs across multiple plantations could produce an enhanced population of workers who would be more productive and therefore more profitable. He envisioned a future where plantation owners throughout the South participated in systematic breeding networks, sharing information and selectively trading individuals to maximize desired traits across regions. The years between 1840 and 1843 marked Ruth's transformation from a physically precocious child into an adolescent whose development continued exceeding projections. By age 13, she'd reached 5 feet 11 inches in height, matching her grandmother Abeni's unusual stature and approaching what would eventually be her full adult height. Her body showed muscular definition that was extraordinary for any adolescent and virtually unprecedented in young women. Her measurements during this period documented development that Vale described in his journals as representing the breeding program's successful culmination. Ruth's chest measured 42 inches around at age 13. Her arms measured 16 inches in circumference. Her shoulders spanned 22 inches across, and her thighs measured 26 inches around. These numbers appeared constantly in Vale's documentation, always accompanied by observations about work capacity, physical capabilities, and breeding potential that treated Ruth as valuable property rather than a human being with thoughts, feelings, and awareness of what was being done to her. But numbers couldn't capture what it meant to inhabit Ruth's body and mind during these years. She understood by now that her physical capabilities were precisely what made her valuable and therefore imprisoned. She was too important to Cornelius's validation of his life's work to ever be free through conventional means. She recognized that Cornelius had already begun planning her reproductive future, identifying male children in the breeding program who would be appropriate matches when they reached maturity, treating her future children as already predetermined elements in his multi-generational experiment. Ruth was aware of these plans because information moved through the quarters in sophisticated ways that white observers never fully understood. Household staff overheard conversations in the main house and shared them. Field workers noticed which young men received extra attention from overseers who were evaluating them for future breeding decisions. People pieced together the larger picture from fragments of information and passed it along through networks built on trust and survival. Ruth knew exactly what Cornelius intended for her, and the knowledge sat inside her like poison, corroding any possibility of hope or future that she might have tried to maintain. During this period, Ruth was assigned to work in Ravenswood's rice mill, a massive structure where harvested rice was processed through steps that required constant heavy lifting. Workers carried 60-pound sacks from storage areas to processing stations, lifted sacks onto tables for sorting, then carried processed rice to wagons for transport to Charleston's docks. The work was brutal, performed in heat that regularly exceeded 100 degrees, with humidity that made breathing difficult, and dust from rice hulls that filled the air, causing lung problems for people who worked there for extended periods. Ruth worked alongside grown men, many of them selected for mill work specifically because of their size and strength. She outperformed most of them, carrying heavier loads, working longer hours without apparent fatigue, maintaining pace that left others exhausted. The men had complex reactions to this. Some respected her abilities and treated her as an equal. Others felt threatened or diminished. Most understood that her strength was both impressive and tragic, evidence of what systematic human breeding could accomplish when people were treated as livestock rather than human beings. Cornelius used Ruth's performance in the rice mill as evidence for his theories, bringing visitors specifically to observe her working. He would stand at a distance with plantation owners from Georgia, North Carolina, and deeper South states, pointing out how she handled loads requiring 2 men to lift normally, how she maintained pace throughout 12-hour shifts, how she showed no signs of the health deterioration that affected other mill workers within months of assignment. These demonstrations were exhibitions disguised as normal work, and Ruth understood that every moment of her labor was being evaluated, documented, and transformed into evidence for Cornelius's theories about human breeding. One visitor during the autumn of 1842 was particularly significant. A Virginia plantation owner named Thomas Hendricks, who operated a tobacco operation near Richmond and had traveled to Charleston specifically to evaluate whether Ravenswood's breeding program claims were legitimate. Hendricks spent 5 days at the plantation, examined Vale's journals extensively, interviewed Cornelius about methodology, and observed Ruth working in the mill for extended periods. He was deeply impressed by what he witnessed and saw Ruth as proof that human beings could indeed be selectively bred for desired characteristics with the same success achieved in horse or cattle breeding. On the final evening of Hendricks's visit, he made Cornelius an extraordinary proposal. He would purchase Ruth for $4,000, an enormous sum that reflected both her demonstrated capabilities and her potential for breeding the next generation of enhanced workers. Hendricks explained his vision with enthusiasm that revealed how thoroughly he'd embraced the concept of systematic human breeding. He would pair Ruth with the strongest male workers on his Virginia plantation, monitor resulting children with the same careful documentation Cornelius had maintained, and potentially develop his own line of specially bred workers that would make his tobacco operation the most productive in the region. He spoke about Ruth as if she were a prize mare whose bloodline would improve his stock, using language that completely erased her humanity while celebrating her physical capabilities. Cornelius's initial reaction was conflicted. Ruth represented 15 years of careful work, the culmination of his father's theories and his own refinements to the breeding program. Selling her would mean abandoning the program's continuation at Ravenswood or starting over with younger subjects who would require decades to develop comparable characteristics. But $4,000 was an enormous sum, more money than Cornelius had ever been offered for any enslaved person, and it represented liquid capital that could be invested in expanding Ravenswood's operations or purchasing additional land and workers. Cornelius asked Hendricks for time to consider the offer, and Hendricks agreed, returning to Virginia with the understanding that Cornelius would send word within 6 weeks about whether he accepted. The potential sale became known throughout Ravenswood's quarters within hours of Hendricks's departure, information passing through the networks that connected household staff who'd overheard the negotiations with field workers and everyone else who lived under Cornelius's control. The news spread in whispers, passed from person to person, until everyone knew that Ruth might be sold away from South Carolina, separated from her mother and grandmother, from the community that had raised her, sent to Virginia to become the foundation of another man's breeding program in a place where she would know no one and have no allies. The reaction in the quarters was mixed and complex. Some saw the sale as potentially positive for Ruth, reasoning that Virginia was further from Cornelius's direct control, and perhaps she would find opportunities to escape or resist that weren't possible at Ravenswood. Others understood that the sale would simply transfer her to different ownership, with no guarantee of better conditions and the certainty of losing every human connection she'd built over 15 years. A few argued that resisting the sale was impossible, that Cornelius owned Ruth completely and could do whatever he wanted regardless of anyone's preferences or feelings. For Ruth herself, learning about the potential sale created a crisis that forced decisions she'd been avoiding through years of careful compliance. She spent a sleepless night after hearing the news, lying in the small quarters she shared with her mother, staring at wooden ceiling beams and trying to understand what options existed, if any. The thought of being torn away from Keturah, from patients who'd delivered her and taught her to survive, from Gabriel, who'd given her frameworks for understanding power and resistance, from everyone who knew her history and cared about her beyond her breeding value, created desperation unlike anything she'd experienced before. She'd endured 15 years of systematic dehumanization by holding on to connections with family and community, by maintaining relationships that reminded her she was a person rather than merely specimen 41 in Cornelius's journals. The prospect of losing those connections, of being isolated in Virginia with no one who understood her past or saw her as fully human, made the future seem unbearable in ways that even the breeding program's daily humiliations hadn't achieved. Ruth went to find Gabriel the following morning, waiting until her work assignment in the mill provided opportunities to move around the property with some freedom. Gabriel worked in the blacksmith shop, a separate building near the main complex, where he repaired tools and equipment that kept Ravenswood's operations functioning. Ruth approached during a moment when no overseers were nearby, and Gabriel immediately recognized the urgency in her expression. She told him about the potential sale, about Hendricks's offer and Cornelius's consideration of it, about her desperation at the thought of being sent to Virginia. Gabriel listened without interrupting, his weathered face showing concern that went beyond sympathy to encompass strategic thinking about what possibilities existed in an impossible situation. When Ruth finished speaking, Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his hands continuing to work on the plow blade he was repairing, while his mind clearly engaged with more complicated problems. Finally, he spoke in a low voice that couldn't be overheard beyond a few feet. "You're stronger than any man on this plantation, stronger than most men anywhere. They've spent 15 years building that strength, thinking it makes you more valuable to them. But strength can serve different purposes than the ones they intended. You understand what I'm saying?" Ruth understood exactly what he was saying, though the implications terrified her as much as they excited her. Gabriel was suggesting that her physical capabilities, developed through Cornelius's breeding program to make her a more productive worker and valuable breeding stock, could be weaponized for resistance. That the same strength that made her impossible to sell to anyone who feared rebellion could be used to prevent the sale through direct action rather than passive acceptance. Gabriel continued speaking, his voice remaining carefully quiet. "I'm not telling you what to do. This is your life, your decision. But I'm telling you that if you decide you won't accept being sold, there are people here who would support you. Not everyone, not even most people. Because the risks are enormous and most folks have families they're trying to protect. But some would help if you needed it. And you should know that Charleston's got networks you don't see, connections between plantations and the city, people who might provide aid if circumstances created opportunities." Ruth absorbed this information, understanding that Gabriel was offering more than just emotional support. He was suggesting that organized resistance might be possible, that she wasn't completely alone in facing impossible choices, and that the community she'd grown up in contained resources and relationships she hadn't fully recognized. She asked him what kind of help might be available, and Gabriel's answer was careful but substantive. There were people in Charleston's free black community who maintained connections with enslaved populations, passing information about escape routes and sympathetic ship captains. There were white abolitionists, rare in South Carolina but present, who might provide assistance under certain circumstances. Most importantly, there were enslaved people throughout the Low Country who understood that resistance required coordination and timing, who'd been waiting for opportunities or catalysts that might make collective action possible rather than individually suicidal. Gabriel told Ruth that if she decided to resist the sale, the first step would be gathering people willing to help create disruption that would make the transfer to Hendricks difficult or impossible. Sabotage of plantation operations, minor at first to avoid immediate suspicion, escalating if necessary to create chaos that would distract overseers and potentially create opportunities for escape during the confusion. He emphasized that such actions would be extraordinarily dangerous, that discovery would result in severe punishment, including death, and that even success wouldn't guarantee freedom, since they lived in a slave state surrounded by other slave states, with hundreds of miles separating them from free territory in the north. Ruth listened to all of this, feeling the weight of decisions that would determine not just her future, but potentially the futures of others who might choose to support her. She told Gabriel she needed time to think, and he nodded, understanding that this wasn't a choice to make impulsively. But as Ruth left the blacksmith shop and returned to the mill, she realized that part of her had already decided. She would not accept being sold to Thomas Hendricks. She would rather die fighting than be transported to Virginia to become the foundation of another breeding program that would consume her children and grandchildren the way Cornelius's program had consumed her life. Over the following 2 weeks, Ruth began preparing for possibilities she couldn't fully articulate yet. She started training others in the same way Gabriel had taught her, sharing techniques for building strength and endurance through exercises that could be performed before dawn or after work assignments ended. She presented this training as practical methods for making brutal labor slightly more bearable, but her real purpose was creating a core group of people who would be physically capable of coordinated resistance if opportunities arose. She gathered small groups, never more than 4 or 5 people at once to avoid suspicion, teaching them how to lift heavy objects efficiently, how to develop the muscles used in fighting or running, how to increase stamina through sustained effort. Some participants understood immediately what Ruth was really preparing them for and committed themselves fully. Others participated more cautiously, willing to build strength, but uncertain whether they could actually engage in open resistance when the moment came. A few refused entirely, too frightened of consequences, or too convinced that resistance was futile against a system backed by overwhelming force and legal authority. Among those who committed most fully was a young man named Isaac, 19 years old, who'd been born at Ravenswood and worked as a field hand in the rice paddies. Isaac had been identified as a potential breeding program participant by Vale, marked for future pairing with carefully selected women once he reached what Cornelius considered optimal breeding age. Isaac understood that his future under the breeding program would involve the same loss of reproductive autonomy that Ruth faced, and this knowledge made him willing to take risks that others avoided. Isaac became Ruth's closest ally during this period of preparation, helping recruit others for the training sessions, providing strategic thinking about how resistance might work if it came to that, and offering emotional support to Ruth as she navigated the psychological burden of planning something that could result in multiple deaths, including her own. Another key ally was a woman named Hannah, 26 years old, who worked in Ravenswood's main house as a cook and laundress. Hannah's position gave her access to information that field workers never heard directly. She could listen to conversations between Cornelius and his wife Margaret, observe documents left visible in Cornelius's study, and notice patterns in how the Ashford household operated. She passed this information to Ruth whenever opportunities arose, creating an intelligence network that helped Ruth understand exactly what was being planned regarding her potential sale and what vulnerabilities might exist in Ravenswood's security. Through Hannah, Ruth learned critical details about the sale negotiations that weren't common knowledge. Thomas Hendricks had paid $1,000 as a deposit, with the remaining $3,000 to be paid upon Ruth's delivery to Virginia. Cornelius had hired professional slave catchers to transport Ruth, men known for brutal efficiency in preventing escape attempts during transfers between states. The transport was scheduled for December 15th, 1842, giving Cornelius time to complete the rice harvest and maximize profit before losing Ruth's labor. Ruth also learned something that changed her entire understanding of what was at stake. Through Hannah's observations, Ruth discovered that Cornelius kept additional records beyond Vale's journals, documents stored in a locked cabinet in his study that detailed the full scope of the breeding program across 3 generations. These records included information about families that had been separated, about children who'd been sold when they failed to develop according to projections, and about Cornelius's plans for expanding the program through networks with other plantation owners across multiple states. Ruth became obsessed with seeing those records, with understanding the complete truth of what had been done to her family and countless others. But accessing Cornelius's study was extraordinarily dangerous. The main house was off-limits to field workers, and any enslaved person found there without legitimate reason would face immediate punishment. Hannah explained that the study's window could potentially be opened from outside, that Cornelius and Margaret often attended social gatherings in Charleston that left the main house less supervised, and that with proper timing and lookouts, someone might be able to access the study briefly. The risks were enormous, but Ruth decided they were necessary. She needed to see those records, needed to understand the full scope of what she was part of, needed documentation that could serve as evidence if opportunities ever arose to tell the story of what had been done. Ruth, Isaac, Hannah, and 2 others began planning the attempt with careful attention to timing and coordination. They chose November 20th for the action, a date when Cornelius and Margaret were scheduled to attend a dinner party at a neighboring plantation, an event that would keep them away from Ravenswood for at least 5 hours. The plan required Hannah to ensure the study window remained unlocked during her cleaning duties, Isaac and another field worker to serve as lookouts, watching for any unexpected returns or patrol routes that might bring overseers near the main house, and Ruth to actually enter the study and examine whatever documents she could find in the limited time available. The evening of November 20th arrived, with typical low-country weather, cool and damp, with fog rolling in from the coastal marshes. Cornelius and Margaret departed for their social engagement in mid-afternoon, traveling by carriage with 2 household attendants. Ruth waited until full darkness, then made her way to the main house with a caution that seemed excessive given her size, but which Gabriel had taught her was essential for successful stealth. Isaac was positioned where he could watch the main road leading to Ravenswood's entrance. Hannah remained in the main house's kitchen, where her presence wouldn't raise suspicion. Ruth approached the study window, which Hannah had left unlocked as planned, and carefully opened it enough to climb through. The study was dark except for moonlight filtering through windows, providing just enough illumination to see shapes and outlines. Ruth waited for her eyes to adjust fully, then began searching for the locked cabinet Hannah had described. She found it against the eastern wall, a substantial piece of furniture made from mahogany with brass fittings and a lock that looked more serious than anything protecting most plantation records. Ruth had anticipated this problem and brought tools Gabriel had provided, thin pieces of metal that could potentially manipulate simple lock mechanisms. She worked carefully, trying to remain quiet while applying pressure that might release the lock's catch. After nearly 15 minutes of careful manipulation, feeling growing panic about the time passing, the lock finally clicked open. Ruth pulled the cabinet doors open and found exactly what Hannah had described: multiple leather-bound volumes containing Cornelius's detailed records of the breeding program. Ruth couldn't read all of them in the limited time available, so she focused on the most recent volume, the one covering 1830 through the present. She read by moonlight, her hands shaking as she absorbed information that exceeded her worst expectations. The volume documented her own development in exhaustive detail, every measurement, every projection about her future breeding potential. Every plan for her children who didn't yet exist, but whom Cornelius had already designated for roles in the program's continuation. But more disturbing than information about herself was what Ruth discovered about others. The volume contained references to dozens of children who'd been born into the breeding program over the past 13 years. Some had been sold to other plantations when they failed to develop desired characteristics. Others had died from illness or accidents that the record suggested might have been negligence or worse when their development disappointed Cornelius. Ruth found names and numbers, brief notations that represented human lives, treated as experimental failures, families deliberately separated to make room for next attempts at achieving desired traits. She found documentation of forced pairings, of women who'd been punished for refusing to comply with breeding assignments, of men who'd been sold away when their children didn't meet expectations. The scope was breathtaking and horrifying, a systematic program of human breeding that had consumed countless lives while producing a handful of individuals like Ruth who met Cornelius's criteria for success. Ruth discovered that she had siblings she'd never known existed, half-siblings from her mother's previous forced partnerships before being paired with Daniel. 2 children, both sold to plantations in Georgia, when they failed to show the height and strength Cornelius projected based on their parents' characteristics. Their names were in the records along with their sale prices and the plantations that had purchased them, information that Ruth committed to memory even as tears blurred her vision. Most disturbingly, Ruth found Cornelius's projections for future generations, plans that extended decades into the future and involved coordination with plantation owners across multiple states. Cornelius had negotiated with Thomas Hendricks about purchasing back any children Ruth produced in Virginia, bringing them to South Carolina to continue the breeding line. He'd made similar arrangements with plantation owners in Georgia and North Carolina, creating a network where children from the breeding program would be distributed across properties, then selectively reunited for breeding as adults to maintain and enhance desired genetic traits. The vision was comprehensive and chilling, transforming slavery from merely an economic institution into a coordinated program of human breeding that would span regions and generations. Cornelius had calculated that enslaved people bred for specific traits could be sold for triple normal prices, creating massive profits that would incentivize other plantation owners to participate in the network. The financial projections were detailed, showing expected returns over 20-year periods, comparing investment costs against anticipated revenue from selling enhanced workers to other plantations. Ruth read all of this with growing rage that clarified her understanding of what was at stake. She'd known the breeding program was cruel, but discovering the full scope, the casual destruction of families, the cold calculation behind every forced pregnancy, the vision of expanding this system across the entire South, transformed her understanding of what needed to be opposed. She carefully removed specific pages from the volume, documents that detailed the breeding program's history and Cornelius's future plans. She wanted evidence, wanted documentation that could potentially prove what had been done, even if she didn't survive to tell the story herself. She folded the pages and tucked them inside her clothing, then replaced the volume in the cabinet and tried to make the lock appear undisturbed. But as Ruth prepared to leave through the window, she heard voices outside the main house. Cornelius and Margaret, returning far earlier than expected from their social engagement. Ruth had perhaps seconds to decide what to do. Attempting to exit through the window would likely result in being seen. Hiding inside the study meant being trapped if Cornelius entered the room. Neither option was good, but hiding offered slightly better chances than being caught climbing out a window in full view. Ruth squeezed herself behind a tall bookshelf in the study's corner where shadows were deepest, pressing against the wall and trying to control her breathing. She heard Cornelius and Margaret enter the main house, heard their voices as they moved through the first floor, heard Margaret complaining about the dinner party being cancelled due to illness in the host family. Ruth's heart was pounding so violently she feared it would somehow give her away, and the stolen documents pressed against her body felt impossibly obvious. Cornelius and Margaret remained on the first floor for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, discussing plantation business and social matters, while Ruth remained frozen behind the bookshelf. Finally, they retired upstairs to their bedroom, and the main floor became quiet. But Ruth couldn't leave immediately without risk of encountering household staff who might still be working. She remained hidden for another hour, muscles cramping from maintaining the same position, fear creating a constant state of alert that exhausted her mentally, even while her body remained motionless. Finally, well past midnight, the house became truly quiet. Ruth carefully emerged from behind the bookshelf, moved to the window, and climbed out as silently as possible. Isaac was still at his lookout position, nearly frantic with worry about Ruth's prolonged absence. She signaled that she was safe, and they both made their way back to the quarters through fog that had grown thicker, providing cover but also making navigation more difficult. Over the following 3 days, Ruth shared what she'd discovered with the small group she'd been training. She showed them the documents she'd taken, explained the scope of Cornelius's breeding program and his vision for expanding it through coordination with other plantation owners. The reaction was horror, rage, and for some, a kind of grim vindication. They'd known the system was evil, but having documentary evidence of systematic human breeding, of families deliberately destroyed across generations, of future plans to expand the program across multiple states, made the evil undeniable and immediate. But possessing this knowledge created a crisis of action. What could they do with this information? They were enslaved people with no legal rights, no access to courts or authorities who would care about their testimony, no way to expose Cornelius's program through official channels. The only authorities they could potentially reach were other plantation owners who likely shared Cornelius's views, or northern abolitionists who were too distant to provide immediate help and whose intervention would probably arrive too late to prevent Ruth's sale to Virginia. Ruth argued that they had to do more than just possess knowledge. They had to act in ways that would disrupt the sale, prevent her transfer to Virginia, and ideally create enough chaos to escape entirely. But escape where? South Carolina was surrounded by slave states, and reaching free northern states required traveling hundreds of miles through hostile territory where slave patrols operated, and any black person without papers would be assumed to be a fugitive, subject to immediate capture. The debate among the group lasted 2 days, with people arguing different positions passionately. Some wanted to attempt immediate escape before the scheduled December 15th sale. Others thought escape was impossible and preferred sabotaging Ravenswood's operations to hurt Cornelius financially. A few were so frightened of consequences that they wanted to abandon the entire plan and hoped that Ruth's situation in Virginia might somehow be better than they feared. Ruth listened to all perspectives, then made her position clear with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. She would not be sold to Thomas Hendricks and transported to Virginia to become the foundation of another breeding program. She would rather die fighting than submit to that future. If others wanted to join her in resistance, she welcomed their help and would do everything possible to protect them. But she understood the risks were enormous and didn't judge anyone who chose survival over resistance. She would act regardless of whether others joined her. Her willingness to die fighting rather than accept being sold changed the dynamic of the discussion. Several people who'd been hesitant committed themselves, inspired by Ruth's resolve or shamed by their own fear, and the core group solidified around 13 people willing to take coordinated action. They spent the next week developing plans that balanced the desire for comprehensive disruption against the need to avoid early discovery that would trigger immediate response before they were ready. The plan they created was multi-layered and designed to create maximum chaos across multiple fronts simultaneously. They would sabotage critical plantation equipment in ways that appeared accidental, start small fires in outlying fields that would require attention without threatening the main complex, damage rice processing machinery to prevent normal operations, and create an atmosphere of escalating disaster that would distract overseers and create confusion that might provide opportunities for escape during the chaos. The timing was crucial. They would begin the sabotage on December 1st, 2 weeks before Ruth's scheduled departure, giving them time to create cumulative disruption while Ruth remained on the plantation where she could coordinate response to changing circumstances. If successful, they hoped to create enough chaos that Hendricks would reconsider the purchase, fearing that Ruth had become a liability rather than an asset. At minimum, they hoped to delay the transfer long enough to explore other options, including potential escape routes Gabriel had mentioned through Charleston's networks. But Ruth had an additional objective beyond preventing the sale or escaping. She wanted Cornelius to understand that he'd created something he couldn't control, that the breeding program hadn't just produced physical strength, but had cultivated intelligence, awareness, and capacity for coordinated resistance. She wanted him to see that treating human beings as livestock to be improved through selective breeding created consequences he hadn't anticipated, that reducing people to measurements and numbers in journals didn't actually eliminate their humanity or their ability to resist the system that oppressed them. The sabotage began on December 1st, with small incidents that could plausibly be attributed to coincidence or carelessness. A plow broke during field work when a deliberately weakened handle snapped. An axe head flew off its mount, nearly injuring an overseer. A wagon wheel shattered under load, spilling rice and creating delays in transport schedules. Each incident by itself was unremarkable, the kind of minor problem that occurred regularly on any plantation. But the frequency and timing suggested either extreme bad luck or something more deliberate. Edmund Vale noticed the pattern immediately and increased surveillance of the quarters, watching for signs of organized resistance. But he couldn't prove intentional sabotage when everything could be explained as equipment failure or worker negligence. Cornelius became increasingly agitated as problems mounted. The rice harvest was being delayed, costing him money and potentially affecting his reputation among Charleston's planter elite. Thomas Hendricks sent a letter questioning whether the sale should proceed, expressing concern that if conditions at Ravenswood were deteriorating, perhaps Ruth's value was affected by whatever problems plagued the plantation's operations. The mounting pressure intensified Cornelius's response. He increased work hours, reduced already inadequate food rations as punishment for perceived carelessness, and authorized overseers to use more severe discipline for any infractions, regardless of how minor. He intended this increased severity to restore order, but it had the opposite effect. People who'd been hesitant to support Ruth's resistance saw no path to improved conditions through compliance, and the base of support for coordinated action expanded. On December 8th, 1 week before Ruth's scheduled departure, the situation escalated dramatically when the rice mill suffered catastrophic structural failure. A support beam that had been carefully weakened over several days through strategic cuts that appeared as natural wood rot finally collapsed during operation, falling across machinery and destroying mechanisms that would require weeks to repair. No one was killed, but several workers suffered injuries serious enough to prevent them from working, further reducing Ravenswood's operational capacity at the worst possible time. That same evening, fire broke out in one of Ravenswood's storage barns, destroying equipment and supplies worth thousands of dollars. The fire appeared to start from a lantern positioned too close to hay bales, a plausible accident, but its timing, combined with the mill collapse, made Vale certain that deliberate sabotage was occurring on a scale that threatened Ravenswood's entire operation. Cornelius called an emergency meeting with his overseers that evening, and Hannah overheard enough of the discussion to understand that new security measures were being implemented immediately. Increased patrols of the quarters at night, restrictions on movement between different areas of the plantation, enhanced surveillance of anyone who'd been near the sites where incidents occurred, and authorization for overseers to use whatever force they deemed necessary to maintain control and prevent further sabotage. These new security measures threatened the planned resistance significantly. Ruth gathered her group that night, in darkness between the quarters and the tree line, keeping their voices low while debating whether to abandon the plan or accelerate it before Cornelius's enhanced security made action impossible. Isaac argued for immediate escalation, reasoning that they'd already disrupted operations enough to make Cornelius suspicious, and waiting would only give him time to identify participants and take preventive action. Others disagreed, saying that accelerating meant abandoning careful planning for desperate improvisation that would almost certainly fail and result in everyone being killed or sold away to destinations where they'd face even worse conditions than they endured at Ravenswood. The debate became heated, with fear and frustration emerging in raised voices that threatened to draw attention from the new patrols Vale had implemented. Ruth let people argue for several minutes, understanding that everyone needed to express the terror they felt about what they were contemplating. Then she made a decision that balanced preparation against the rapidly closing window of opportunity. They would act on December 13th, 2 days before her scheduled transfer to Virginia. That gave them time to finalize details while Cornelius's security was still being organized and implemented. It was their best compromise between preparation and the need for immediate action before circumstances made resistance completely impossible. When the meeting ended, 13 people had committed to attempting escape if opportunities arose during the planned chaos. 27 others said they would participate in creating diversions, but wouldn't flee because they had young children or elderly family members they couldn't abandon, or because they were simply too frightened of the consequences that would follow discovery. Ruth thanked everyone for their courage, understanding that even those who chose not to run were taking enormous risks by supporting the disruption. She also understood that this might be the last time she saw many of these people, that the plan they'd developed had realistic chances of ending with multiple deaths, including her own. Over the next 3 days, Ruth moved through her assignments with unusual focus, aware that these might be her final days at Ravenswood. She memorized details of the landscape, noting the positions of overseers during different times of day, observing patterns in the new patrol schedules Vale had implemented, identifying the best routes toward Charleston if escape became possible. She was preparing for the night of December 13th with the same methodical attention Cornelius had applied to measuring her development for 15 years, except now that attention served her purposes rather than his. She also took time to speak privately with her mother Keturah and her grandmother Abeni, who was now elderly and frail but still possessed the fierce dignity that had sustained her through more than 4 decades of enslavement. Ruth told them what she was planning, not in specific detail, but enough that they understood she was preparing to resist her sale to Virginia through actions that might result in her death. Keturah wept, holding Ruth and expressing the helpless fury of a mother watching her child face impossible choices in a system designed to destroy families. Abeni didn't weep, but spoke with a intensity that made every word feel like a blessing and a command. "You carry our strength. Your grandmother's grandmother was tall like you, strong like you, free like we were meant to be. They tried to breed us like animals, but they just concentrated what we already had. That strength is yours, not theirs. Use it however you need to. We'll be proud of you regardless of what happens." December 13th arrived with weather that seemed to reflect the tension building at Ravenswood. Storm clouds gathered over the low country throughout the day, bringing wind that rattled shutters and bent trees, creating an atmosphere of impending violence that matched what Ruth and her allies were preparing to unleash. Ruth worked her assigned shift in the rice mill, performing her tasks with the same efficiency she'd maintained for years, while internally preparing for evening's planned actions. As darkness fell, the storm intensified, bringing rain that fell in heavy sheets and lightning that illuminated the plantation in brief, stark flashes. Ruth waited in the quarters until after midnight, when most people had gone to sleep despite the storm's noise. Then she moved through the darkness, touching doors in prearranged signals. 13 people emerged, all dressed in dark clothing, carrying small bundles of food and supplies they'd managed to gather without raising suspicion. Ruth led them toward the coastal route Gabriel had identified as offering the best chance of reaching Charleston's waterfront, where sympathetic ship captains might potentially provide passage further north. They'd covered perhaps 300 yards, moving between buildings and using the storm's noise to mask their movement when a shout rang out behind them. A patrol had spotted the group despite the darkness and rain, recognizing that a large number of people moving together at night represented exactly the kind of coordinated action Vale had warned everyone to watch for. What happened next occurred with shocking speed. Ruth had known discovery was likely and had prepared mentally for confrontation. When the overseer approached, ordering them to stop and raising his rifle, Ruth didn't comply with the command. Instead, she did something that 15 years of controlled rage and cultivated strength had prepared her for. She attacked. Her first strike broke the overseer's arm with force that made bones snap audibly even over the storm's noise. Her second blow threw him to the ground with impact that drove air from his lungs and likely cracked ribs. She moved with efficiency, born from years of lifting heavy loads and understanding exactly how to generate and apply force. The other two overseers present hesitated in shock, never having witnessed an enslaved person engage in direct, violent resistance, certainly never having seen a woman attack with such devastating effectiveness. That momentary hesitation cost them. Isaac and two others attacked, while the overseers were distracted by Ruth's assault, and within seconds all three plantation authority figures were on the ground, disarmed and injured seriously enough that they wouldn't be pursuing anyone immediately. "Run!" Ruth shouted to her group. "Toward the coast! Stay together!" They ran through storm and darkness, leaving Ravenswood's main complex behind. Behind them, alarms were being raised as the injured overseers managed to alert others, but Ruth's group had perhaps a 15-minute head start before organized pursuit could begin. Ruth's plan had been to reach Charleston's waterfront, approximately 8 miles distant, where Gabriel had contacts among the free black community who might provide temporary shelter and information about ships departing for northern ports. But reaching Charleston required covering significant distance across open country where they'd be visible once daylight came, and they had to do it while slave catchers organized pursuit with dogs and weapons. They ran through fields and woods, stumbling in darkness over ground made treacherous by rain and mud, driven by fear and hope and Ruth's unshakable will to avoid capture. Some struggled to keep pace with Ruth's longer stride and superior conditioning, and Ruth would fall back to help them, using her strength to literally carry people when necessary, refusing to leave anyone behind despite knowing that slowing down increased capture risks for everyone. By dawn, they'd reached the marshy wetlands that bordered Charleston's northern approach. They could see the city in the distance, church steeples and warehouse roofs visible through morning haze, so close but separated by tidal creeks and mudflats that would be difficult to cross quickly. Behind them, they could hear sounds of pursuit, dogs barking, men shouting, the organized chaos of slave catchers beginning their hunt with the methodical efficiency that came from years of experience tracking fugitives through the low country's difficult terrain. Ruth understood that their brief window was closing rapidly, that within hours, professional trackers would be following their trail with dogs trained specifically for this purpose and armed men who wouldn't hesitate to use violence. "Into the marsh," Ruth commanded. "The water will hide our scent from the dogs, at least temporarily. Stay close to me and watch for deep channels." They entered the wetland, cold water rising to their waists, mud sucking at their feet with each step, marsh grass cutting their hands as they pushed through dense vegetation. The crossing took more than 2 hours, during which time 2 people nearly drowned in deep channels and had to be rescued by Ruth, whose height and strength allowed her to maintain footing where others couldn't. They eventually reached firmer ground on Charleston's outskirts, exhausted and terrified but still free. Ruth led them into the maze of alleys and back streets that characterized Charleston's working districts, areas where free black laborers, enslaved people on errands for their owners, and suspicious white observers, all mixed in complicated patterns. Gabriel had told Ruth to look for a boarding house on Cumming Street, run by a free black woman named Sarah Grimble, who sometimes provided shelter to fugitives. Finding the location in daylight, while avoiding slave catchers and suspicious white citizens who might report them, required moving carefully through streets where their wet, muddy appearance and obvious exhaustion made them stand out dangerously. They eventually located the boarding house, a modest, two-story wooden structure that looked unremarkable from outside. Ruth approached the door and knocked, hoping desperately that Gabriel's information was accurate and that Sarah Grimble would be willing to risk everything to help strangers. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, her expression wary but not hostile. Ruth spoke quickly, identifying herself as coming from Ravenswood and saying that Gabriel had sent them. Sarah Grimble's expression shifted immediately to something between concern and resignation, the look of someone who'd known this moment might come and had been dreading it. She pulled them inside quickly, closing the door and checking the street to ensure no one had observed their arrival. The boarding house's interior was cramped and dark, but it was dry and warm and represented the first moment of relative safety Ruth's group had experienced since fleeing Ravenswood 12 hours earlier. Sarah provided them with dry clothing, food, and information about their situation that was grimly realistic. Slave catchers were already in Charleston, searching for fugitives from Ravenswood. Cornelius Ashford had offered a substantial reward for Ruth's capture, $300, an enormous sum that would motivate every slave catcher and bounty hunter in the region. Charleston's white population was on alert for suspicious groups of black people, and the city guard had been notified to watch for fugitives. Sarah could provide shelter for perhaps 2 days at most before the risk of discovery became too great, and she had limited resources for helping them move beyond Charleston. The situation was desperate, but not completely hopeless. Sarah explained that a ship named the Providence was scheduled to depart Charleston on December 16th, 3 days away, bound for Philadelphia with a captain known to be sympathetic to fugitives. If Ruth's group could remain hidden until then and get to the docks without being captured, they might be able to secure passage north. But the wait would be extraordinarily dangerous, and moving 13 people through Charleston to the waterfront without being discovered would require careful planning and significant luck. Ruth listened to all of this while trying to manage her own exhaustion and the psychological whiplash of being closer to freedom than she'd ever been, while simultaneously being more vulnerable than at any point during her 15 years of enslavement. She thanked Sarah for her willingness to help and asked what they could do to minimize the risk to her. Sarah's response was pragmatic and sobering. The best thing they could do was remain absolutely quiet and hidden, avoid any contact with the outside, and be prepared to flee immediately if slave catchers came to the boarding house. Sarah would try to gather information about the Providence's exact departure time and arrange for someone to guide them to the docks when the moment came, but she couldn't guarantee anything beyond temporary shelter. Over the next 2 days, Ruth's group remained in Sarah Grimble's boarding house, 13 people crowded into 2 small attic rooms, barely moving during daylight hours when noise might draw attention. They could hear the city beyond the walls, street vendors calling their wares, carriages passing, occasionally slave catchers making inquiries at nearby buildings. Each sound created tension that made breathing difficult, and everyone remained in a state of constant alert that was mentally exhausting even while their bodies rested from the flight. Sarah brought them food and information periodically, and the news was increasingly concerning. Cornelius had increased the reward for Ruth's capture to $500, and Thomas Hendricks had arrived in Charleston personally to coordinate with slave catchers, furious about losing his investment and determined to see Ruth captured. Professional slave catchers from as far as Georgia were converging on Charleston, drawn by the substantial reward. The city guard had increased patrols, and white citizens were being encouraged to report any suspicious activity involving groups of black people. On the evening of December 15th, The day Ruth had originally been scheduled for transfer to Virginia, Sarah brought news that the Providence's departure had been delayed until December 18th due to cargo loading problems. The delay meant Ruth's group would have to remain hidden for 2 additional days, increasing the likelihood of discovery exponentially. Several members of the group argued that they should abandon the plan to reach the ship and instead attempt to flee Charleston immediately, heading north overland, despite the enormous risks that entailed. Others insisted that reaching the ship represented their best chance, that attempting overland escape would almost certainly result in capture within days. Ruth listened to both perspectives, understanding that there were no good options, only choices between different forms of terrible risk. She decided they would wait for the Providence, reasoning that if they could remain hidden for 2 more days, actually reaching free territory through ship passage was more realistic than surviving hundreds of miles of overland travel through slave states. But that night, December 15th, everything collapsed. Slave catchers discovered the boarding house, likely through information extracted from someone Sarah had contacted about the Providence. Ruth's group was awakened at midnight by sounds of forced entry below, men shouting. Sarah Grimble's voice raised in protest before being silenced. Ruth understood immediately that they'd been discovered and that the building was surrounded. There would be no escape through normal exits. The only possibility was the attic window that looked out over an alley, a drop of approximately 15 feet that would be dangerous but survivable. Ruth ordered everyone to the window immediately, helping people climb through and drop to the alley below, while sounds of slave catchers ascending stairs grew closer. She waited until everyone else had jumped, then followed them out the window, landing hard enough to feel impact through her knees but without injury. They ran through Charleston's maze of alleys, with slave catchers in pursuit, scattering in different directions, as they realized staying together made them easier to track. Ruth, Isaac, and 3 others managed to stay together initially, but within blocks they were separated as different slave catchers pursued different targets. Ruth found herself running alone through pre-dawn darkness, her size and strength allowing her to maintain pace that gradually opened distance between herself and her pursuers. She eventually reached Charleston's waterfront, the docks extending into Cooper River, where ships waited for cargo and favorable tides. Ruth had no specific plan at this point beyond avoiding immediate capture. She moved along the waterfront, trying to identify which ship might be the Providence, hoping desperately that she could somehow reach it and convince the captain to provide passage, even without the organized coordination Sarah Grimble had been arranging. But professional slave catchers had anticipated that fugitives might attempt to reach the docks, and they'd positioned men at strategic points. Ruth was spotted as dawn broke, her unusual height and build making her impossible to mistake for anyone else once slave catchers had clear sight of her. What followed was a confrontation that would become legendary in Charleston's oral history among both enslaved and free black communities. Ruth was cornered on a pier extending into the river, with slave catchers approaching from the land side, and no escape except into water that would be difficult to cross given the current and her exhaustion. The lead slave catcher, a man named Jacob Trent who was known for brutal efficiency, called out for her to surrender, promising that compliance would result in lighter punishment than resistance. Ruth's response was to attack. She charged toward Trent and his companions, moving with speed that shocked men who'd assumed her size would make her slow and clumsy. She tackled the first man she reached, her momentum carrying both of them into the river, where the cold water and current immediately created additional chaos. Other slave catchers converged on the pier, firing warning shots that were intended to intimidate, but which only seemed to enrage Ruth further. She emerged from the river, pulled herself back onto the pier, and continued fighting with accumulated fury from 15 years of dehumanization, of being measured and evaluated, of being reduced to specimen 41 in breeding journals, of knowing that Cornelius Ashford had planned every aspect of her life, including children she hadn't yet conceived. She fought with the strength 3 generations of systematic breeding had created, strength meant to make her a more valuable worker, but which now served as a weapon against the system itself. She broke bones, inflicted injuries that would leave men hospitalized for weeks, and for several minutes it seemed possible she might actually overwhelm the slave catchers through sheer physical dominance. But there were too many of them, and they had firearms. Ruth was shot in the leg, a wound that would have incapacitated most people but which only seemed to slow her slightly. She was shot again in the shoulder, beaten with rifle butts, and eventually overwhelmed through simple arithmetic of multiple men restraining her simultaneously. Even then, it took 8 men to hold her down, and they had to use chains meant for securing cargo because rope wouldn't restrain her strength. By the time Cornelius Ashford arrived at Charleston's waterfront, later that morning, brought by urgent message about Ruth's capture, 4 members of her escape group were dead from drowning or gunshot wounds during various captures throughout the city. 5 others had been captured alive but injured. 4 had escaped into Charleston's free black community and disappeared, their fates unknown. Ruth herself was chained to a dock post, bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds and numerous other injuries, her clothing torn and soaked with river water and blood. Cornelius surveyed the scene with an expression that combined fury, satisfaction, and calculating assessment. He'd lost enslaved people he'd invested years in developing, had suffered financial losses from the sabotage at Ravenswood and the collapsed sale to Thomas Hendricks, and had been humiliated by Ruth's resistance, becoming widely known among Charleston's planter elite. But he'd also captured Ruth alive, and that meant he could still salvage something from the disaster. He could reshape the narrative from embarrassing rebellion into a demonstration of plantation management's ultimate effectiveness in controlling even the strongest and most resistant enslaved people. Thomas Hendricks appeared alongside Cornelius, his expression revealing that the sale was definitively cancelled. Hendricks wanted nothing to do with Ruth after witnessing the violence of her capture and the deaths that had resulted from her resistance. He withdrew completely from any business relationship with Cornelius and left Charleston that same day, returning to Virginia, convinced that systematic breeding programs created more problems than they solved. Other potential buyers who'd previously expressed interest in Ruth similarly withdrew, fearing that purchasing her would import instability and violence onto their own plantations. Ruth had become infamous rather than valuable, and the publicity around her resistance made her effectively unsellable to anyone concerned about maintaining control over their enslaved population. Cornelius faced a difficult decision about what to do with Ruth. He couldn't sell her, but keeping her was dangerous and expensive. She required constant surveillance, secure confinement, and medical treatment for her gunshot wounds that would cost money he resented spending on someone who'd caused enormous losses. He ultimately decided to keep Ruth as an example, a living demonstration that resistance would be punished absolutely, and that even the strongest enslaved person could be broken and controlled. He had her wounds treated by a physician. Infection would have killed her otherwise, and he wanted her alive for what he planned, then confined her to a structure specifically built for her imprisonment. A cell-like building with brick walls 2 feet thick, barred windows set high enough that even Ruth couldn't reach them, and a door reinforced with iron bars and multiple locks. She was kept in chains inside the cell, heavy iron restraints on her wrists and ankles that connected to bolts set in the floor, limiting her movement to a small area in the center of the room. Ruth's punishment extended far beyond confinement. She was put to work at the hardest tasks Ravenswood offered, always under armed guard, always chained, always isolated from other enslaved people to prevent her influence from spreading and inspiring others to resistance. Her food rations were reduced to minimal survival levels, eliminating the extra nutrition she'd received throughout her life and deliberately attempting to reduce her physical strength through inadequate nourishment. Cornelius intended to break her completely, to transform her from a symbol of resistance into a warning about resistance's consequences. Vail documented her decline with the same meticulous attention he'd used recording her development, noting decreases in her measurements as inadequate nutrition caused muscle loss, recording her capacity for work as it diminished, treating her deterioration as data points in a longitudinal study about what happened when enhanced workers were subjected to punitive conditions. But Cornelius made a critical miscalculation, born from his obsession with documentation and his conviction that his breeding program represented valuable scientific achievement. He kept his journals despite everything that had happened, despite clear evidence that his records had been compromised, despite the fact that Ruth's rebellion had demonstrated the consequences of treating human beings as breeding experiments. He believed the journals were too valuable to destroy, representing his life's work and his father's before him. Documentation that proved systematic human breeding could produce measurable results. He had the journals bound in new leather covers after the escape attempt, locked them in a reinforced safe in his study, and convinced himself they were secure. The fire at Ravenswood occurred on January 22, 1843. Approximately 5 weeks after Ruth's capture, it started in the early morning hours around 3 o'clock when everyone in the main house was sleeping. The fire began in multiple locations simultaneously: Cornelius's study, the adjoining library, and the ground floor storage room, spreading with unusual intensity and creating flames that consumed the structure's wooden interior with devastating speed. Cornelius, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children escaped through second-floor windows, suffering smoke inhalation and minor burns, but surviving. 5 enslaved household staff members also escaped, though 2 were badly burned, trying to fight the fire before realizing the house couldn't be saved. The investigation into the fire's cause was inconclusive. The official determination was accidental, likely a lamp left burning that overturned or a spark from a fireplace that caught on papers and drapes. But some observers noted suspicious aspects. The fire's unusual intensity, its apparent origin in multiple locations simultaneously, and the complete destruction of Cornelius's study, while other parts of the house showed less severe damage. No evidence directly connected the fire to any person. Ruth was locked in her cell with guards watching constantly, making it impossible for her to have started it personally. Other enslaved people at Ravenswood had no obvious opportunity or means to access the main house at that hour and start fires without being discovered. Yet rumors circulated through the quarters about justice, about how sometimes fires start themselves when they're needed, about ancestors watching and taking action, about the documents Cornelius valued more than human lives, meeting the fate they deserved. People whispered about the stolen pages Ruth had taken during her November 20th infiltration of the study, wondering if others had taken similar actions that contributed to the fire's origin or spread. The speculation would never be resolved definitively, but what mattered wasn't how the fire started, but what it destroyed. The journals documenting 3 generations of systematic human breeding burned completely. The reinforced safe Cornelius had installed proved inadequate against sustained fire that reached temperatures hot enough to warp metal and ignite everything inside. When the ruins cooled enough for investigation, searchers found only ashes and twisted metal where Cornelius's life work had been stored. The pages Ruth had stolen during her November infiltration survived because she'd given them to Isaac before the escape attempt, and Isaac had buried them in a waterproof pouch in Charleston before being captured. Isaac died 3 days after capture from injuries sustained during pursuit, but before dying he told another captured fugitive named Marcus where the documents were hidden. Marcus survived his punishment and was eventually sold to a North Carolina plantation, but he remembered the location and retrieved the documents in 1856 when he successfully escaped to Philadelphia through the Underground Railroad. Marcus turned the documents over to William Still, the famous Underground Railroad conductor who kept detailed records of fugitives he helped. Still recognized the documents' historical significance and preserved them in his archives. Those pages, 17 sheets of Cornelius Ashford's handwriting, documenting systematic human breeding across 3 generations, calculating financial returns from selling children, projecting future expansion of breeding programs across multiple states, eventually became part of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's collection where they remain today. Historians who've studied those pages describe them as among the most disturbing documents to survive from the antebellum period. Not because they describe unusual cruelty, many plantation records document horrific acts, but because they demonstrate the systematic, calculated nature of treating human reproduction as agricultural science conducted with the same cold rationality as crop rotation or livestock improvement. The pages reveal how slavery wasn't merely economic exploitation, but an attempt to control human biology itself, to shape future generations according to profit calculations and pseudo-scientific theories about heredity and racial characteristics. Ruth remained enslaved at Ravenswood until 1847. The years following her capture and the fire were characterized by brutal routine designed to break her will without killing her outright. She worked under constant guard at the hardest tasks, lived in isolation from the community that had supported her, and endured conditions meant to reduce her physically and psychologically. Cornelius never rebuilt the main house to its former grandeur. The fire had cost him enormous sums on top of losses from Ruth's sabotage and the escaped workers who represented valuable property he'd never recover. He constructed a smaller, more modest residence and operated Ravenswood with reduced staff and resources. His breeding program effectively ended with the fire that destroyed his documentation. Without those records, he couldn't track lineages or make informed decisions about future pairings. In 1847, facing continuing financial difficulties and needing liquid capital, Cornelius sold several enslaved people to settle debts. Ruth was among them, purchased by a cotton merchant from Alabama named William Crawford for $600, far less than the $4,000 Thomas Hendricks had once offered. Reflecting both Ruth's age, she was now 24, and her reputation for resistance that made her less valuable to buyers who feared importing trouble. Ruth was transported to Alabama and put to work in cotton processing, heavy labor that utilized her remaining strength while keeping her under surveillance. Records show she worked at Crawford's operation until at least 1860, appearing in that year's census records as property valued at $500. Her worth having declined further as she aged, and the physical capabilities that had made her exceptional diminished from years of punitive treatment. After 1860, documentation ends. Whether Ruth lived to see emancipation in 1865, whether she survived the Civil War years when Alabama became a battleground, whether she ever found the half-siblings Cornelius's records had revealed existed scattered across Georgia, whether she lived long enough to have children of her own under circumstances where they would be free rather than enslaved, none of these questions can be definitively answered from surviving records. The story fades into silence after 1860, leaving Ruth's ultimate fate unknown. Ravenswood Plantation continued operating until 1864, when Union forces advancing through South Carolina liberated enslaved people and destroyed infrastructure supporting the Confederacy. Cornelius Ashford died in 1861, and the plantation passed to a cousin who sold it after the war ended. The property changed hands multiple times over subsequent decades, and by the early 20th century, the original plantation buildings had largely decayed or been demolished for materials. What remains today are fragments scattered across archives and historical society collections. The 17 pages in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, brief mentions in letters between plantation owners discussing Cornelius's breeding program, census records listing Ruth's existence as property with decreasing monetary values, court documents from Charleston describing her capture and the deaths that occurred during the escape attempt. Newspaper articles from December 1842 reporting on the disturbance at Ravenswood and the apprehension of fugitive slaves in Charleston. These fragments tell part of the story, but they represent thousands of untold stories, families destroyed, children sold away, reproductive lives controlled, futures planned by people who viewed human beings as livestock to be improved through selective breeding. Local historians in Charleston and the surrounding Low Country maintain oral traditions about Ruth that have been passed down through generations of African American families whose ancestors lived through slavery. These stories, collected by researchers from the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, describe Ruth as having become a legendary figure in the communities that remembered her, though the stories changed over time, gaining elements that reflected how communities needed to remember trauma and resistance. Some versions say Ruth escaped Alabama during the Civil War and made it north to Philadelphia, where she lived to old age. Others say she died in Alabama, but that her spirit never accepted bondage and continues to haunt the places where she was held. Still others say she had children who inherited her exceptional strength and that her descendants carry that legacy today, scattered across the country but connected through shared history. These variations reveal how memory works in communities that survived systematic oppression, how stories become vessels for hope and resistance even when historical facts are incomplete or contradictory. What remains indisputable is the documentary evidence of what was done to Ruth and countless others through breeding programs that operated across the South with varying degrees of systematic methodology. Ruth's story asks uncomfortable questions about what human beings are willing to do to each other when one group possesses absolute power over another, when scientific reasoning is used to justify dehumanization, and when profit calculations override any consideration of human dignity or suffering. The breeding programs weren't exceptional in their cruelty. They were typical of slavery's broader logic, but their documentation provides unusually clear evidence of how enslaved people were systematically reduced to biological material whose reproduction could be controlled and manipulated according to owners' preferences and financial interests. Dr. Pemberton's diaries, which survived alongside the pages Ruth had stolen, to provide a white observer's perspective on these programs, that's remarkable for its moral clarity, even while acknowledging his own complicity. Pemberton continued his medical practice in Charleston through the 1840s and 50s, but his diary entries from those years reveal a man increasingly troubled by what he'd witnessed at Ravenswood and what that suggested about the society he lived in. He wrote about the contradiction between Charleston's self-image as a cultured Christian society and the brutal reality of systematic human breeding conducted with scientific precision. He questioned whether any society could claim moral authority while treating a significant portion of its population as livestock to be improved through selective pairing. Pemberton recorded his reactions to Ruth's capture and the violence that occurred during the escape attempt, noting that he'd been called to treat some of the injured slave catchers and had seen firsthand the damage Ruth had inflicted. He wrote about being simultaneously appalled by the violence and understanding why someone subjected to 15 years of systematic dehumanization would fight with such desperate fury when facing transfer to another breeding program. He described Ruth as having been created by Cornelius's program in ways Cornelius never fully understood, that breeding someone for strength while denying them humanity produced not just physical capabilities, but psychological characteristics that included awareness, intelligence, and capacity for strategic resistance. Most significantly, Pemberton wrote about the fire that destroyed Cornelius's records, expressing what he called relief that evidence of such systematic cruelty had been erased, even while recognizing that erasing evidence doesn't erase what was done or prevent similar programs from operating elsewhere. He noted that other plantation owners continued discussing breeding programs at social gatherings he attended, that Cornelius's failure hadn't discouraged them, but had merely made them more cautious about documentation and more careful about maintaining absolute control over enslaved populations. Pemberton died in 1878, 20 years after South Carolina's enslaved population was freed through Union victory in the Civil War. His final diary entry, written 3 days before his death, returned to Ruth's story one last time. He wrote about wondering whether she'd survived to see freedom, whether the strength that had made her both valuable and dangerous had allowed her to endure conditions that killed others, whether she'd found any peace or happiness after emancipation, or whether the psychological damage from 15 years of breeding, program surveillance, and 4 years of punitive confinement had been too severe to overcome. Pemberton's diaries were donated to the South Carolina Historical Society by his daughter in 1892, and they remained largely unexamined until the same graduate student who discovered the stolen pages from Cornelius's journals found Pemberton's papers in 1962. The student, a woman named Eleanor Foster, who was researching antebellum medical practices for her dissertation, recognized immediately that Pemberton's observations about Ravenswood's breeding program connected directly to the documents William still had preserved. Foster spent years tracking down every available fragment of information about Ruth, Cornelius Ashford, and the breeding program, eventually publishing a comprehensive study in 1971 titled Systematic Breeding Programs in the Carolina Low Country, a case study of Ravenswood plantation. Foster's research established that breeding programs were far more common than most historians had recognized, that they operated across the South with varying degrees of organization and documentation, and that they represented a form of slavery's horror that went beyond labor exploitation to encompass deliberate control of human reproduction across generations. Her work helped establish breeding programs as a crucial element of slavery's broader system, something that needed to be understood and remembered rather than minimized or forgotten. Foster interviewed elderly African Americans in Charleston and the Low Country who remembered stories about Ruth passed down from ancestors who'd known her or known people who'd known her. These oral histories provided details that didn't appear in written records, information about Ruth's personality, her relationships with others in the quarters, her intelligence and strategic thinking, her determination to resist despite understanding the consequences. One interview subject, a woman named Cecilia Washington, whose great-grandmother had been enslaved at Ravenswood, told Foster that family tradition held that Ruth had successfully escaped Alabama during the chaos of the Civil War's final year, that she'd made it to Philadelphia and lived there under a different name, working as a laundress and never speaking about her past except to say she'd survived something no one should have to endure. Washington said her great-grandmother had received letters from Ruth in the 1870s and 80s, letters that confirmed she was alive and free, but which revealed little about her emotional state or whether she'd found happiness after emancipation. These letters supposedly existed until the 1920s, when they were lost in a house fire, another of history's cruel ironies, evidence destroyed by the same force that had destroyed Cornelius's journals. Whether the letters were real or had become part of family mythology was impossible to determine, but Washington believed absolutely in their existence and in Ruth's survival. Foster's research was groundbreaking for its time, but it also sparked controversy among some historians who felt that focusing on breeding programs risked creating sensationalized narratives that distracted from slavery's broader economic and political dimensions. Foster defended her work by arguing that understanding slavery required confronting all of its forms of violence, including those that involved controlling reproduction and deliberately breeding people like livestock. She maintained that breeding programs revealed slavery's underlying logic more clearly than other aspects because they demonstrated how thoroughly enslaved people were viewed as property whose value could be enhanced through the same techniques used for animal husbandry. The debate Foster's work generated reflected larger conversations happening in American historical scholarship during the 1970s about how to remember and teach slavery's history, what aspects deserved emphasis, and how to balance acknowledgement of horrific practices with respect for enslaved people's humanity and agency. These conversations continue today, with historians still debating how to present breeding programs in ways that acknowledge their systematic cruelty without reducing enslaved people to victims who possessed no capacity for resistance or self-determination. Ruth's story provides one model for this balance because it demonstrates both the horror of what was done to her and her own agency in resisting, her strategic thinking and physical courage, her willingness to risk death rather than accept conditions she found unbearable. The physical sites associated with Ruth's story have largely disappeared or been transformed beyond recognition. Ravenswood Plantation's original buildings no longer exist, replaced by residential development that began in the 1950s and accelerated through subsequent decades. The land that once contained rice fields and the quarters where Ruth grew up is now subdivided into lots holding suburban houses occupied by people who likely have no knowledge of what occurred there more than 150 years ago. The Charleston waterfront where Ruth was captured has been completely rebuilt multiple times, transformed from working docks serving rice and cotton trade into tourist destinations and luxury developments. The pier where Ruth fought slave catchers has been demolished and reconstructed so many times that nothing remains of the original structure. Sarah Grimball's boarding house on Cumming Street survived into the early 20th century, but was demolished in 1923 to make room for commercial development. The cell where Ruth was imprisoned at Ravenswood after her capture was torn down decades ago, its bricks likely repurposed for other construction, its history forgotten by everyone except scholars who research archival documents. This physical erasure is typical of how slavery's sites have been treated across the American South, demolished or transformed or simply allowed to decay until nothing visible remains to mark where horrific events occurred. The erasure isn't accidental but reflects deliberate choices about what history deserves preservation and commemoration versus what history is more convenient to forget. For more than a century after the Civil War, there was little public acknowledgement of breeding programs or other aspects of slavery that made white Americans uncomfortable. Historical markers focused on battles and political events, on great men and grand narratives, avoiding the intimate violence of how enslaved people's bodies and reproductive lives were controlled. This began changing in the late 20th century as civil rights movements and evolving historical scholarship demanded more honest engagement with slavery's complete reality. Today, there are efforts to mark and commemorate sites associated with slavery, including places where breeding programs operated, though these efforts remain incomplete and controversial in many communities. In Charleston, the Avery Research Center works to preserve oral histories and document sites associated with enslaved people's experiences, including locations connected to Ruth's story. They've identified the approximate location of Sarah Grimball's boarding house and are working to have a historical marker installed that acknowledges its role in providing shelter to fugitives, despite enormous personal risk to Grimball. They've also documented the location where Ravenswood Plantation once stood and are developing educational materials that explain what occurred there, including the breeding program and Ruth's resistance. These preservation efforts face resistance from some community members who argue that focusing on slavery's darkest aspects harms Charleston's reputation and discourages tourism. But advocates counter that genuine historical understanding requires confronting uncomfortable truths rather than sanitizing the past to make it more palatable. They argue that Ruth's story deserves to be remembered, not despite its difficulty but because of it, that her resistance represents courage and humanity persisting under conditions designed to destroy both. The broader historical significance of breeding programs extends beyond individual stories like Ruth's to encompass questions about how slavery functioned as a system and what that system reveals about human capacity for rationalized cruelty. Breeding programs demonstrate that slavery wasn't merely an unfortunate economic system that happened to involve human bondage, as some 19th century apologists and even some modern historians have suggested, but was fundamentally about treating human beings as property whose value could be enhanced through the same techniques used for livestock improvement. The systematic nature of programs like Cornelius Ashford's, with their careful documentation and multi-generational planning, reveals that this wasn't casual cruelty, but calculated dehumanization conducted with scientific precision. The fact that plantation owners could discuss breeding programs openly at social gatherings, could seek advice from each other about optimal pairing strategies, could maintain detailed records without shame or legal concern, All of this demonstrates how thoroughly slavery had normalized the complete objectification of enslaved people. Ruth's physical strength, which should have been a gift allowing her to protect herself and others, became the foundation of her oppression precisely because it made her more valuable as property. The tragic irony is that every measurement Edmund Vail recorded, every demonstration Cornelius organized for visiting plantation owners, every projection about her future breeding potential, all of it represented the system's success in achieving exactly what it intended, while simultaneously creating conditions that would generate resistance. Ruth's story also raises questions about resistance itself, about what forms it takes and how it should be evaluated. Her armed revolt and escape attempt failed in the immediate sense. She was captured, others died. The breeding program continued operating until external forces destroyed Cornelius's documentation, and slavery itself persisted for another 2 decades until military defeat forced its end. But Ruth's resistance succeeded in other ways that are harder to measure but perhaps equally significant. She prevented her own sale to Virginia, disrupting Cornelius's plans and Thomas Hendricks's breeding program ambitions. She destroyed or contributed to the destruction of documentation that might have allowed breeding program methodologies to be refined and expanded. She created a story of resistance that inspired others and became part of oral tradition sustaining hope through dark years. Most significantly, Ruth demonstrated that enslaved people possessed agency even under the most oppressive conditions, that systematic dehumanization couldn't eliminate human capacity for strategic thinking, coordinated action, and willingness to risk everything rather than accept conditions that violated fundamental dignity. These forms of resistance mattered even when they didn't achieve immediate freedom, because they preserved humanity in situations designed to destroy it and created possibilities for future resistance by demonstrating that action was possible. The documents that survived, the 17 pages Ruth stole and the sections from Pemberton's diaries, serve as testimony to what was done and what was resisted. They exist in archives where researchers can study them, where students can confront uncomfortable truths about their country's history, where descendants of enslaved people can find some acknowledgement of their ancestors' suffering and courage. The fact that these documents survived when Cornelius's complete journals didn't carry its own significance, suggesting that history sometimes preserves the evidence of resistance more reliably than evidence of oppression's systematic methodology. If stories like Ruth's fascinate you, if you want to hear more about the hidden histories that shaped America, about the people who resisted impossible odds and the systems that tried to break them, then you need to subscribe to The Sealed Room. We bring you the stories that mainstream history overlooks, the dark truths that demand to be remembered, the voices that were silenced but which echo still through time. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us which state you're listening from, because these stories deserve audiences who remember what happened and ensure it's never forgotten. Ruth's legacy extends beyond historical documentation to encompass broader questions about how societies remember difficult pasts and what obligations present generations have to acknowledge historical injustices. The fact that breeding programs operated openly across the South, that they were discussed in polite society as agricultural innovations rather than moral abominations, that legal systems provided no protection to enslaved people subjected to reproductive control. All of this reveals how thoroughly dehumanization can be normalized when supported by economic interests and racial ideologies. Understanding this normalization is crucial for recognizing how similar processes operate in different contexts, how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty when systems make such participation seem rational or necessary. Ruth's story doesn't provide easy lessons or comfortable conclusions. It shows human beings at their worst, creating systematic programs of breeding and control, and at their best, resisting with courage and intelligence, despite facing overwhelming force. It shows how strength can be both gift and curse, how documentation can serve both oppression and resistance, how memory preserves truth even when physical evidence disappears. The story asks us to sit with uncomfortable truths about what was done to people like Ruth, to acknowledge the scale and systematic nature of slavery's violence, and to recognize that this history's effects persist in present inequalities and traumas passed across generations. The questions Ruth's story raises remain relevant today. How do societies reckon with systematic injustices from their pasts? How should historical sites of violence and oppression be marked and remembered? What obligations do present generations have to acknowledge and address historical wrongs? How do we balance respect for victims' suffering with acknowledgement of their agency and resistance? These questions don't have simple answers, but avoiding them because they're difficult means allowing injustice to be forgotten and patterns of dehumanization to continue unchallenged. Ruth's measurements, recorded so meticulously by Edmund Vail, told one story about her. She was 6 feet 3 inches tall at full growth, with a chest measuring 48 inches around, arms measuring 19 inches in circumference, shoulders spanning 23 inches across. She could lift over 300 pounds, could work 12-hour shifts in brutal heat without apparent fatigue, possessed strength that exceeded most men's capabilities. But these measurements, for all their precision, couldn't capture what mattered most about Ruth. Her intelligence that allowed her to understand the system controlling her, her strategic thinking that enabled coordinated resistance, her courage that made her willing to die fighting rather than accept conditions she found unbearable, her humanity that persisted despite 15 years of being treated as specimen 41 rather than a person with inherent dignity and worth. The real mystery isn't how someone could be bred to possess unusual physical characteristics. The mechanics of heredity and selective pairing are well understood. The real mystery is how enslaved people like Ruth maintained their humanity under conditions designed to destroy it, how they created communities and cultures that sustained resistance across generations, how they preserved memory and passed down stories that kept truth alive when official records were destroyed or never created. The real mystery is how people endured what should have been unendurable and emerged with their capacity for love, hope, and resistance intact. Ruth's story, preserved through fragments of documentation and oral traditions passed down through generations, represents thousands of similar stories that weren't preserved, people who resisted in ways large and small, who maintained dignity in situations designed to strip it away, who created meaning and built relationships under conditions that should have made both impossible. These stories matter not just as history, but as testimony to human resilience and as warnings about what happens when systems treat people as property whose value can be enhanced through control and manipulation. The breeding programs that created Ruth were slavery's logic taken to its extreme conclusion, demonstrating with unusual clarity what the entire system was always about. Treating human beings as things whose bodies could be controlled, whose reproduction could be managed, whose children could be sold, whose families could be destroyed, all in service of profit maximization and racial hierarchy maintenance. Understanding this requires confronting how thoroughly slavery dehumanized both the enslaved and those who enslaved them, how it corrupted moral reasoning and normalized cruelty, how it created systems so comprehensive that resistance seemed futile, even while remaining necessary. The fact that we can tell Ruth's story at all, that fragments of evidence survived, allowing historians to reconstruct what happened, represents its own form of resistance. The people who preserved oral traditions, who maintained memory across generations, who ensured that stories were passed down even when written records disappeared, they performed crucial work of historical preservation that challenges dominant narratives and prevents injustice from being forgotten. The documents that survived, stolen by Ruth and preserved through networks of resistance, serve as testimony that can't be erased or explained away, evidence of systematic cruelty that demands acknowledgement and remembrance. Today, more than 180 years after Ruth fought slave catchers on a Charleston pier, her story still matters. It matters to descendants of enslaved people who seek to understand their ancestors' experiences and honor their resistance. It matters to historians working to create more complete and honest accounts of American history. It matters to educators teaching students about slavery's realities beyond sanitized textbooks. It matters to anyone interested in understanding how systems of oppression function and how people resist them. Most fundamentally, Ruth's story matters because it insists that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents who made choices under impossible constraints, who resisted when they could, who built communities and maintained cultures despite systematic attempts to destroy both, who preserved their humanity in circumstances designed to eliminate it. The archives where Ruth's story survives contain other stories equally disturbing and equally important. Stories of children sold away from families, of women subjected to sexual violence, of men worked to death in fields and factories, of communities destroyed and reformed and destroyed again across generations. These stories collectively paint a picture of slavery as systematic violence operating at scale, sustained through force and maintained through legal systems that provided no protection to those it oppressed. Ruth's story stands out because of the unusual documentation that survived, and because her physical exceptionality made her resistance particularly dramatic, but she represents countless others whose stories were never recorded or whose records didn't survive. Every enslaved person who lived under breeding program control, who was paired with someone not of their choosing, who had children sold away or saw family members separated for breeding purposes, experienced the same fundamental violence Ruth endured. Their stories deserve the same attention, even when documentation is incomplete or non-existent. Understanding Ruth's story requires understanding the broader context of how slavery functioned in the Carolina Low Country, how rice cultivation created particular forms of brutality, how Charleston's economy depended on enslaved labor, and how that dependence shaped every aspect of social and political life. It requires understanding how breeding programs fit into slavery's larger logic, how they weren't aberrations, but extensions of the basic premise that enslaved people were property whose value could be enhanced through owner intervention. It requires understanding how resistance operated through multiple channels, from armed revolt to subtle sabotage to cultural preservation to memory maintenance, and how all these forms of resistance mattered even when they didn't achieve immediate freedom. The coastal marshlands where Ruth ran from slave catchers remain largely unchanged in their physical geography. Tides still flow according to moon phases. Live oaks still grow draped with Spanish moss. Egrets and herons still fish in tidal creeks. The land remembers nothing of what happened there, but human memory preserved through documents and oral traditions maintains the record of Ruth's flight and capture, ensuring that her story remains available to those willing to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker truths still buried in archives and family records across the South? The documents that survived tell part of the story, but how many other breeding programs operated without leaving traces we can find today? How many other people like Ruth resisted in ways that were never documented? How many families were destroyed through systematic breeding that we'll never know about because records were destroyed or never existed? These questions remain open, inviting further research and continued engagement with history that demands attention. If you found this story powerful and want more untold histories that reveal uncomfortable truths about America's past, subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the stories they tried to bury, and share this with someone who needs to hear Ruth's story. Her resistance mattered. Her courage mattered. Her refusal to accept conditions she found unbearable mattered. And remembering her matters too, because memory is its own form of resistance against those who would prefer these stories remained hidden.